Hello, my name is Olga Loya. Welcome to Scary Stories. People of all ages love a good story, but somehow, in the rush of the world, some people felt that they couldn't stop to tell or listen to a story. Now, people are making the time for stories, and storytelling is enjoying a wonderful revival. This program is all storytelling, from the oral tradition, continued and reborn. Just the tales, the tellers, and the listeners. Stories are told in many places, private parties, in the public, and especially at family gatherings. Our own ethnic heritage is a wonderful source of stories. This program will have 4 North American storytellers from 4 different cultures telling their stories about goblins and skeletons or things that go bump in the night. Almost all cultures have scary stories, and lots of people love to be scared. But if you don't like to be frightened, remember to listen to these stories with someone older. I'll be telling the first story, The Flying Skeleton. Once there were 3 boys who lived with their tío uncle because their parents were dead. They had 3 older brothers who helped the tío. And the boys were happy except for one thing. El tío dormía todo el día. The uncle slept all day. He would get up in the afternoon, he would do his chores, he would make dinner for the boys, and then he would put them to bed and he'd say, "Quédense en la cama, no salgan del cuarto, mándenme. Stay in your bed, don't come out of your room, mind me." And they did. The 3 boys were Pedro, who was 12, Jose, who was 11, and Juanito, who was 10. And Jose and Juanito, as long as they had something to eat and a place to sleep, they never asked any questions. But Pedro, he wondered about everything. He'd think, ¿Por qué duerme mi tío todo el día? Why does my uncle sleep all day? One night, he woke up and he heard sounds in the kitchen. He wanted to go see what the sounds were, but he remembered his uncle's words. Quédense en la cama, no salgan del cuarto, mándenme. Stay in your bed, don't come out of your room, mind me. And he did. But the second night he woke up and he heard the same sounds and he could not resist. He went tiptoeing to the kitchen and he looked through the door and he saw skeletons dancing and singing, and one of the skeletons had a hat on just like his tío uncle. Pedro went and he woke up his brothers and he told them what he'd seen, and the brother said, "Ay, como eres mentiroso, what a liar you are." He said, "No, it's not verdad, it's the truth. Come and look." And they tiptoed to the kitchen and they looked through the door, and there were the esqueletos dancing and singing. And the boys, they didn't know what to do. They went back to the room and they talked and they talked. Finally, days later, they finally decided what they had to do was they're going to follow their uncle. Because now they knew that every night he left, they'd hear the door open, and they'd hear the door close. So one night, the boys followed their uncle. They stayed in the shadows. And then they hid behind a tree and they watched their uncle. He was standing in a field in front of a huge stone. And he started to dance around the stone. And suddenly he stopped. He threw open his arms and he said, "Vete de mí, mi carne, vete de mí. Go from me, my flesh, go from me." And all the flesh fell away in a pile in front of him. And all that was left was an skeleton. And then he whirled around and he came back in front of his flesh. He had alas, wings, beautiful transparent wings. Y se fue volando, haciendo sonidos como huesos quebrando. And he flew away making sounds like bones breaking. And the boys, they said, "Oh, what are we going to do? Our tío, our uncle's a brujo, a witch." Well, they decided to wait to see what would happen. In the madrugada, in the early morning hours, the tío returned. He stood in front of his flesh and he said, "Vuelva a mí, mi carne, vuelva. Come back to me, my flesh, come back." And all the flesh came back. And there was their uncle. He was looking up in the sky, and the boys, they tiptoed away and they ran home. And now They could not sleep. Every night they heard the skeleton, and they knew it was the tío. And they came up with this plan and that plan, and finally they thought they had the perfect plan. And one night, when the tío went out, they followed him in the shadows. They hid behind the tree again. And that tío, he stood in front of that stone, and he started to dance and dance. And then he threw his arms out and he said, "Vete de mí, mi carne, vete de mí." And again the flesh fell away from him. And all that was left was an esqueleto. And he whirled around and he had alas, wings, y se fue volando, haciendo sonidos como huesos quebrando. And he flew away, making sounds like bones breaking. This time, the boys waited until he had disappeared. And then they tiptoed up to that flesh. Pusieron sal en esa carne. They put salt on that flesh. Pusieron jugo de limón. They put lemon juice on that flesh. Pusieron salsa. They put chili on that flesh. And then they went and hid behind the tree and waited. In the madrugada, the tío, he came back and he stood in front of that flesh and he said, "Vuelva a mí, mi carne, come back to me, my flesh." Pero nada pasó, nothing happened. He said it again and nothing happened. He leaned down and he looked and he saw that salt and that lemon juice and that chili, and he knew he was never, ever going to be able to use that flesh again. Ah! He screamed, y se fue volando, haciendo sonidos como huesos quebrando, and he flew away, making sounds like bones breaking. And the boys, well, they went home, and they did well. Their brothers helped them. But sometimes, in the dark of the night, that village can hear sounds like bones breaking above them. And the boys know it's their uncle, still looking for his flesh. But the people of the village, they say that when someone hears the sounds of bones breaking, that someone is going to die. And now telling will be John Spellman from Washington, D.C.
Scary stories. When I was a kid, I was always scared by every story. I was scared by everything. My older brother scared me. My older sister scared me. The cabbage lady that they said lived in our backyard scared me. The rubber man in the basement scared me. My dad told me that there was a rubber man that lived in our basement, and if I did not learn how to do what was right, well, that rubber man would come upstairs at night and bounce on me and squash me flat. Boy, I listened to those stories. The summer after I was in the 5th grade, my family moved to a new house. And for the first time, I had my own room. I didn't have to share with my brother. It was neat. It was a big room, and it had wooden paneling, and that was nice. But we'd been there about 2 weeks when I realized I had a problem. Directly above my bed, I hadn't noticed it before, but once I saw it, it was unforgettable, was a big, dark knothole that looked like a combination between a skull and a giant mouth. And the moment I saw that, I knew that if I ever lay down in that room again with all the lights off, that thing would open up like a giant mouth and swallow me in one big bite. So I went and I told my mother about that, and she said, "Oh, well, that's too bad." She said, "We would hate to lose you to a mouth hole." What do you think we could do about that? And I said, "I'll just sleep with all the lights on." And she allowed us how that wasn't such a good idea, but perhaps a night light might work. And I said, "Well, it might. Let's try it." So that night we were setting up a night light, and it looked like it was going to work, you know. And my dad walked by. He said, "What's that?" I didn't say anything. "What's that? Is that a night light?" "Yeah." "What, you need a night light?" "Yeah." "What are you, a sissy?" "Yeah." My mother said, "Leave him alone." So he left me alone. I got to keep the night light, but he decided since he wasn't going to take it away from me, he was going to torment me until I gave it up willingly. He was going to tease me until I said, please take the nightlight. This routine started. It went on every night for about 2 weeks. My dad would make sure he was the last one who came into my room each night. I'd be lying in bed reading stories, which is still how I fall asleep, lying in bed reading stories. And he would come over and he'd pull down the shade by my window. He'd take away my book, put it up on the bedside table, turn off my bedside lamp so it would be dark, pull up the covers up over my head. It would be even darker. I'd have to pull them back down. As soon as I pulled the covers back down, he'd whack me on the rear end, friendly-like, you know. And then he'd say, good night, Jughead. And on the way out, he would reach down and he would snap off my nightlight so it was pitch black. Pop! 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 I quickly learned I had to yell 3 or 4 times. That's what it would take him to stick his head back around the door, because he was just waiting around out in the hall until I yelled. And he'd stick his head around. Did you call? Yeah, I did. What's the matter, John? You turned out my nightlight. I did? Gee, do you need a nightlight? Yes, I do. Well, I guess if a big fella like you needs a nightlight, he needs to have it. All righty. And then he'd turn it on and leave. He was driving me crazy. As I say, it went on for about 2 weeks. Finally, one night he came in, same routine, you know. Down goes the shade by my window, away goes the book, off goes the bedside lamp, up come the covers, whack, good night, Jughead. Out he went, off went the nightlight. Pop! Pop, this is stupid. Pop, this is scary. Pop! I guess he'd actually forgotten, because I heard him running all the way up from downstairs. He came tearing down the hall, he racing in the room. What's the matter, son? Are you all right? I said, no, I'm not all right. You turned off my nightlight. And then he got very serious. He said, Jonathan? He said, Jonathan? And I thought, oh boy, here comes a lecture. He went over, he got the chair from by my desk, he set it down by my bed. He reached over and he let up the shade on my window and he said, Jonathan, listen to me, son, listen. There is no need to light a nightlight on a light night like tonight. Because a nightlight's lights, it's just a slight light. And tonight's a night that's light. So when a night is light, like tonight is light, it's just not quite right to light that nightlight with its slight light, right? So good night. You sleep tight. And don't let the bed bugs bite. And then he left. And that was the very first time I ever heard anyone mention bed bugs. And my first thought was that they were big and soft. And if you rolled over on them in the night, they would squish and stick to you. I didn't dare move. I just lay there like this. I woke up in the morning, I was like this. I was really stiff. But I looked over and I realized that the nightlight was off. It had been off all night long. I'd made it through the night and nothing had gotten me. And now that I know that my house doesn't have bed bugs, I don't need a nightlight anymore. Well, unless I've been out the night before telling scary stories. Or unless I stop and think about that rubber man in the basement. But now I've also learned there's a way to keep away scary things from stories. You just take your 2 shoes that you've worn that day. Remember this, anybody, if you ever get scared by a story. Your 2 shoes you've worn that day, and just put them side by side, make sure they're touching each other. Put the toes of your shoes underneath your bed, about halfway under your bed, so the heels are sticking out and the toes are underneath. And if you do that, nothing from a story will get you in the night. And I know that works, because no rubber man has ever gotten me. Thanks. Thank you.
Here is Alice McGill from Columbia, Maryland.
Once, in the middle of a great big straw field, there plopped a little one-room log cabin. The log cabin had been built by a little old man who walked around all the time like this because he had spent the last 45 years setting traps in and around the swamp so as he could catch muskrats and all, and he'd take them to town and sell them. Then he'd have money to take care of himself and his 3 dogs. One dog's name was I know. One dog's name was You Know. And the third dog, his name was Comptico Calico. They lived back there in that little log cabin with that old man, and he built the cabin himself. The logs were glued together with a little bit of mud, a little bit of cement, a little bit of dirt, rags, paper, and whatever else he could find to stick between the cracks to keep out the rain, the wind, and the weather. He had one window in this log cabin, one door. On one side was the fireplace, and the other, his pots and pans and old traps and rags and chairs and whatever else he wanted to keep there in that corner. One week he went out to check on all of his traps, and every trap, one by one, turned up empty. He couldn't find not one muskrat, so he had to go to town anyhow to look for something to eat for himself and his 3 dogs. When he got to town, he found that he had enough money to buy a little 2-pound bag of cornmeal. He bought it, took it back home, went over in the corner and got a pot, made a fire in the fireplace, put water in that pot and stirred that cornmeal up, and then he spoonfuled that cornmeal right out onto the hot ashes. They were called ash cakes. People used to eat them like that, you know. Well, after they got done, he raked them all out and brushed the ashes off and called his dogs. I know, you know, come to Calico. Dogs ran into the house and he gave them each a pile. He ate the rest. Gave his dogs some water, put them out, and they went on up under the porch. He sat there in front of the fireplace, watching the flames get lower and lower until he fell asleep. There he stayed until there came a noise in the chimney corner. He sat up in that chair and looked up in the fireplace chimney, and there a great big old hairy-like animal had squeezed itself in through one of the big cracks. It was running up and down trying to squeeze itself out. He looked over, saw his hatchet, picked it up, and went bam! And that thing squeezed on back out through that crack. But it left its long, fuzzy tail. He felt it up, went over in the corner, got a pot, put water in it, put it back on the fireplace, stoked up the fire, heated up that water, cleaned all the hair off that tail. Got another pot, put salt and pepper in it, put it back on the fireplace, cooked it, and ate it. It reminded him of oxtail soup. After he'd eaten it, he felt real good. Had meat under his belt. He quickly got his little lamp, put it beside his bed, blew it out, and eased himself between the covers in the little cot that scooched right up under the window. He pulled the covers up around his neck, and before long, he fell into a deep sleep, and there he stayed until around 12 o'clock that night, when there came, he heard. He sat up in bed and said, "Who's there? Who's there?" And a voice said, "Taily-po, Taily-po, I want my Taily-po." And the man said, "Here, I know, you know, Calico." That's all he got out of his mouth. Them dogs ran from under that porch and round to that side of the house and chased that thing all the way down in the swamp. He lay there listening to them dogs barking and that thing cutting through the tall broomstraw grass and the dogs barking and barking, and he heard the dogs come back, go up under the porch, and he felt so much better. The dogs were back. He was safe. He pulled the covers up around his ears and went to sleep. And there he stayed until around 2 o'clock that morning. He opened his eyes, looked at the front door. There, the latch on the front door was jumping up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. And it was jumping up and down like that because something on the other side of that door was going doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. And he said, "Who's there?" And the voice said, "Taily-po, I want my Taily-po." The man said, "Oh, yeah, I know." That's all he got out of his mouth. The dog started running, chasing that thing all the way down in the swamp. He lay there listening to them dogs barking and that thing running and barking and barking and barking, and he didn't hear the dogs come back. He said, "Here!" The dogs didn't answer. He got up out of bed, opened the door, and looked out. And all he saw was the moonlight shining across the broom straw grass. All was so quiet. He closed the door, latched it, and pulled all his traps and pots and pans and tables in front of the door, ran and jumped back into bed and covered up his whole face. He was so scared. He lay there rocking, and he fell into a troubled sleep until around 3:30 that morning. He uncovered his face. He didn't uncover his face because he saw something. He didn't uncover his face because he heard something. He uncovered his face because he felt something, like something was in the room with him. And his eyes started traveling. He saw his fireplace, the front door, the latch, and all the pots and pans were there. His old traps and all, the old clothes. And his eyes shifted to the foot of the bed. There he saw, coming over the foot of the bed, two great big ears. And he said, "Oh!" And that thing started crawling along his body, got even with his chest, snaked its head around and whispered in his ear and said, "Taily-po, Taily-po, I want my Taily-po." The man said, "I ain't got your Taily-po." And the thing said, "Yes, you do. Yes, you do have my Taily-po." And with that thing scratched up the whole bed. There's nothing there now. The logs rotted away years ago. The dogs never did come back. Well, the fireplace chimney, that's there. And it shoots up out of the tall broom straw grass. If you were to go there and stay until around 12 o'clock at night and waited until the moon shone down in the hollow, you listen good, you hear? Because you might hear, "Taily-po, Taily-po, I got my Taily-po." And that's all to it.
Next is Joe Bruchak from Greenfield Center, New York.
The Adirondack Mountains of New York State are old mountains. There are many stories in those mountains. This is one of those stories. Now, there was a man named Henry von Hovenberg who came to live in the Adirondacks around the end of the last century. Von Hovenberg built himself a lodge he called Mount Joe up near Heart Lake in the foot of the high peaks. And there, Henry von Hovenberg led a sort of solitary life because even though he took in tourists in the summertime and sometimes guided people through the mountains, he mostly spent his time out by himself walking along those trails, walking trails that no other white man had ever walked before, although the native people who still lived in those mountains knew a bit about them, and do indeed to this day. Well, one day Henry von Hovenberg was out walking along a trail deep in the mountains. Ho! Hey! Ho! Hey! And as he walked along, he thought he saw the sunlight glittering off of something inside a hollow tree. Well, he came close and he reached inside and he pulled out an old musket gun. That gun was so old that the wood of it had been eaten away by insects, but had been wrapped up in some deerskin, which was the way that the Indian people used to take a spare gun and put it in a tree just in case they needed it in an emergency. So that gun, the metal of it had been preserved, even though the wood had been eaten. He took that gun, he began to look at it, and he noticed there on the trigger guard was a piece of rawhide connected to a pouch. And he managed to open that pouch up, and he pulled out a piece of parchment paper. Well, that parchment paper was so crumpled up he couldn't even make it move, so he took it right back home to his lodge and got a kettle boiling and held that paper over the steam, and gradually that paper got softer and more supple, and he was able to unfold it. And he put it down on his table and he looked at it in wonder, because what he had there was obviously some kind of a map. But the language on it he'd never seen before. He couldn't read it at all. Well, just then, as chance would have it, a friend came to visit him. And this friend was an Abenaki Indian, a guide named Mitchell Sabattis. Now, in those days, Mitchell was a young man. He was only about 75. You got to understand, Mitchell lived to be 110 years old. And one of the things Mitchell liked to do was visit his friends, and seeing as how Henry von Hohenberg only lived about 40 miles away from him, he just walked over to say hello. And he noticed Henry there looking at that map on that table. And Henry looked up and saw Mitchell and said, "Mitchell, come and take a look at this. I can't make head or tails of it. What do you suppose this is?" Mitchell looked at it and said, "It's a map, Henry." "Well, I know that, Mitchell, but I can't make heads or tails of what this funny writing is." Mitchell said, "It's written in Abenaki, Henry." Well, Henry von Hohenberg looked at him in surprise. He said, "You mean you can write?" And Mitchell said, "Well, I did go to Dartmouth College, in case you didn't know that." And of course he didn't know that. And then Mitchell Sabattis began to tell him what that map said, because it was written in the language of his Abenaki people, and it had been written on that piece of paper more than 100 years before. It was written, Mitchell told him, during the time when the French were fighting the English, and that map was a treasure map. It told where a treasure which was taken by the Abenakis along with the French from down south in the state heading back towards Montreal, where a treasure had been hidden because they were too tired. And there were too many injuries among them from this war party to carry this treasure any further. Well, of course, as soon as he heard the word treasure, Henry von Hohenberg got real interested. But as he was reading that map, Mitchell Sabattis stopped and said a word that Henry von Hohenberg had never heard before. "Ah," said Mitchell, "Chibai." "Chibai? What's a chibai?" "I don't think you want to know, Henry," said Mitchell. But Henry von Hohenberg insisted. Mitchell Sabattis explained. "Chibai is a ghost. And according to this map, there's a ghost guarding that treasure, because the biggest man in that party of warriors had been wounded. He was the one carrying that chest full of treasure. And when they reached this point here in the mountains, he could go no further, and he died. But before he died, he told them to leave his body to guard that treasure so that no one but his people could ever come and take it away. And this map tells how to find that place." Well, Henry von Hohenberg said, "I'll tell you what, Mitchell, you and I go halves on it. You come with me." But Mitchell Sabattis shook his head. He said, "Nope, I got everything I need in these mountains. Don't need no treasure." "Ho? Hey!" But Henry von Hohenberg insisted. He said, "I'm going to go look for it. Mitchell, tell me what I got to do." And Mitchell Sabattis told him. And the instructions on this map were kind of strange. It didn't just say, go here, turn right, turn left, go there. What it said was this. It said, you must go to the top of Algonquin Peak at the height of the full moon, in the moon when the raspberries are ripe. That's August. And there, when that full moon reaches its height, the beams of that moon will shine across the valley and strike the side of Mount Colden. And it will show you there a cave that can be seen at no other time. And inside that cave is the treasure. Well, when the full moon of the month when the raspberries are ripe came, you know where Henry von Hohenberg was. Just sitting all by himself right on top of Algonquin Peak and looking hard across that valley. And the beams of that moon, just when it reached its height, shone across that valley, struck the side of the mountain, and he could see there a cave he had never seen before, even though he'd climbed Mount Colden a dozen times. That cave was finally visible to him. Well, Henry von Hovenberg had a hurricane lantern, and he took that lantern and he began to scramble down the side of Algonquin Peak, and on his way down he dropped the lantern and it broke. But that full moon was so bright he figured he could still find his way, and he reached the foot of Mount Colin and he scrambled up until he came to that ledge. He reached one arm up, the other arm up, pulled himself up on that ledge, and the moon shining over his shoulder shone into that little cave, and he began to go inside. The light of the moon over his shoulder just enough to find his way. Touching the sides of the cave as he went further and further back in, and then his foot struck something that had a hollow sound to it. Well, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a match, lit it up, and looked, and by golly, there was an old wooden chest, bound with brass, so old the brass had turned color, and he reached down and he opened that chest up, and he could see something glittering inside. Looked like something that he was real interested in. And he reached down to feel his hand inside that chest when all of a sudden, whew, that match of his went right out. And not only that, when that match went out, it was dark in that cave, so dark that it made Henry von Hovenberg wonder, how come I can't see the moonlight no more? And he turned around to look. And there in the mouth of the cave, he could see the figure of a big, big man. "Who are you?" von Hovenberg said. That figure didn't say a word. "Who are you?" said von Hovenberg. And then, meow! With a scream, that figure leaped at him, grabbed him by the shoulders and lifted him up. Now, Henry von Hovenberg was a strong man. He wasn't tall, but he was stocky. He could lift up a 100-pound barrel of nails over his head with one hand and stove in the end of a cask with the other. But he struggled against this figure, and he couldn't make any headway at all. It was like he was a little child being held up by a grown man. He could feel the leather of the man's clothing, but he couldn't get free. And that big man carried him right over to the mouth of the cave, lifted him high in the air, and threw him. And he went bouncing down the side of that mountain. That was the last he remembered till he woke up the next morning. The sunlight in his face, his body covered with scratches and bruises, and his leg broke in 2 places. Well, he had his jackknife with him. He carved himself a crutch, and he managed to make his way back to his lodge. And it was some days before he told folks his story. You know, most of them didn't want to believe it, at least at first, until he showed them what he had still had in his hands. Because in one hand, he had the rotting fringe from an old leather jacket. And in the other hand, he had a silver coin with the date 1743 and the picture of the English king on it. Well, even though he looked many a day, but not many a night, to try to find that cave again, von Hovenberg never did discover it. And a funny thing, too, he never went back on top of Algonquin Peak at that time of year to look. So it may be that treasure is still there. So if you want to go at the height of the full moon, in the month when the raspberries are ripe, to the top of Algonquin Peak and look across toward Colden and see that cave, maybe you too can find out if that treasure is there. And maybe the Chibai will find you. And so that story goes. Now,